Hey guys, the first episode of The Chosen Season 3 has finally arrived on the new Chosen app, so while we get excited about the latest adventures of our favorite Bible characters and eagerly anticipate the arrival of Episode 2 next week, it's time to break down Episode 1 and recap exactly what happened. Before we do so, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you know exactly when more videos like this are coming, because I have a whole lot of Chosen related content planned for y'all in the weeks and months to come. Also, be sure to give a like on this video because that really helps algorithm wise. Without further ado, let's get to the breakdown. Episode 1 begins with a 3-year flashback to AD 24, where Alphaeus, the father of Matthew, is being confronted by a Roman official for falling behind on his taxes. Matthew tries to buy his father some time, and he successfully convinces the Roman to leave, but this results in a tense conversation between Matthew and his dad. Alphaeus rebukes him for abandoning his family and his faith, but Matthew argues that he was simply choosing a secure future for himself, suggesting that he had to do something for himself since Adonai hadn't been doing anything for his people in a long, long time. Alphaeus renounces Matthew as his son, and when Elisheva comes out, Alphaeus announces that they are going into Shiva, a week-long period of mourning, for their son is dead. Back in the main timeline, the episode picks up right where Season 2 left off, Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount. After all the work poor Nathaniel put into making that stage and all the fuss fans made about Jesus preaching from a stage, it seems like Jesus only used it for his initial greeting, because everything we see of the sermon is preached from on the ground, standing amidst the crowd, while Jesus is directing his words to all who have ears. However, it's clear from the very beginning that having ears is not enough. One must truly hear what Jesus is saying. As Jesus speaks of reconciling with one's brother before offering a gift at the altar, Matthew's ears perk up. As Jesus speaks of being anxious, Mary Magdalene, Judas, and Andrew pay close attention. Eventually, Mother Mary asks Matthew how Jesus is doing, and Matthew assures her that the content is the same, but the delivery is what truly sets it apart. With this, we cut to the opening credits. After the credits, we're right back where we left off. Jesus catches Simon Z's attention when he speaks of eyes for eyes and teeth for teeth. He catches both Atticus and Simon's attention when he speaks of loving your neighbor and hating your enemy. He catches Mary Magdalene's attention when he speaks of forgiving debts, and Zebedee, Matthew, and many more disciples' attention when he speaks of laying up treasures in heaven. As Jesus introduces the crowds to the Lord's Prayer, his disciples say it with him, showing that they've been very good disciples and have been practicing it ever since he taught it to them at the end of last season. The sermon concludes with Jesus telling all who hear that if they hear his words and obey them, they will be like a wise man who builds his house upon a rock. As people depart the sermon, Yusuf ponders what has just taken place, wheels turning in his head as he tries to process how to move forward. Judas greets Bob the businessman, whose real name is Adad, and explains that he is going to follow Jesus. Adad isn't a fan of this idea, but Judas won't take no for an answer, and he departs. Gaius and Atticus are likewise dumbstruck by what they've just witnessed, handling it just as we would expect them to. Gaius through silent contemplation, and Atticus through witty remarks. We cut behind stage, where Jesus is eating food prepared for him by his mother. Matthew approaches Jesus to ask for some clarifications regarding the sermon, mentioning that he recognized some of Jesus' teachings to be similar to the Rabbi Hillel's. While Jesus is impressed by Matthew's increased studying and thanks him for helping with the sermon preparation, he explains that now is not the time, as he wants to talk with his new friend. Judas walks up and introduces himself to Jesus. He explains that he attended the Jewish school of Bet Midrash for a short time, but Jesus explains that that really isn't necessary for any of his disciples. Judas also explains that his financial skills would make him a useful asset as a disciple of Jesus. Jesus tells Judas that following him will be difficult, but Judas says that he doesn't care. He wants to change the world. Jesus asks if Judas is willing to do hard things, and Judas says that he is. Jesus simply says, "We'll see," and he calls Judas to follow him. Jesus introduces the rest of the group to Judas and explains that they're going to need to take some time off, especially Simon, who has some other things that he needs to attend to. He thanks them for their efforts and for all their help with the sermon, and he prays the Aaronic blessing over them. Then they depart. Next, the women meet Joanna, an aristocratic woman who wants to offer monetary support to Jesus' ministry. The women are suspicious, but when they hear that Joanna is familiar with the conditions of John the Baptizer, they call Andrew over. Jesus eventually comes over as well, and Joanna informs him that John was hoping Jesus would pay Herod a strong visit sometime soon, though he's trusting Jesus with the timing. Jesus grants Andrew permission to go visit John, leading Andrew to share a brief farewell with Simon. Andrew thanks Simon for being a good leader, and Simon thanks Andrew for introducing him to Jesus in the first place. Thomas asks Rhema if he could come by and visit her the next day after second meal, but she responds by asking him if he could come after first meal instead. At first, Thomas being Thomas, he doesn't pick up on her flirtatious hints, but as she finally walks away, he is left thoroughly satisfied that she enjoys spending time with him. To his embarrassment, Shula and Barnaby are likewise just as enthusiastic, having been standing there the entire time and witnessed the entire encounter. We finally cut away from the sermon grounds to the Capernaum synagogue, where Yusuf runs out of ink while writing furiously on a scroll. He meets Jairus, the new synagogue administrator, who explains that he just recently started. In the brief encounter, we learn some of their backstory, some of which might be significant later. Yusuf has family back in Jerusalem, and Jairus has a 12-year-old daughter with him in Capernaum. When Yusuf explains that he has witnessed some interesting things that demand documentation, Jairus offers to protect Yusuf's documents. Meanwhile, Simon is finally reunited with his wife, and being in her presence once more has left him, well, wanting to do things that married couples do. When a knock comes at their door, Simon tries to act like they aren't home, but at Eden's insistence, they open the door to find Nathanael, who voices his need for a place to stay. Simon obviously hates this idea, but Eden welcomes Nathanael in, and after some not-so-subtle hints from Simon, Nathanael says that they don't have to worry about him, he'll just put a pillow over his ears. Remember that scene from Shrek 2 whenever Shrek and Fiona return from their honeymoon and Donkey won't stop pestering them even though Shrek is heavily implying that he would really like some time alone? Yeah, it's kind of like that scene. Meanwhile, Simon Z also shows up at the door. Looks like he and Nathanael are going to be roommates. Big James and John banter back and forth, with Big James voicing his desire to be home while John is still enthralled by everything they've been hearing from Jesus. When Thomas greets them, John and Thomas share a special handshake, throwing James off a little bit. Zebedee greets the 3 disciples of Jesus of Nazareth and declares them a triple blessing in his house and welcomes them in with a big ol' hug. Thomas mentions that he has something he wants to talk to them about, but once again, Big James is the only one out of the loop, which seems to be a continuing trend as we go into season 3. At the same time, Mary Magdalene, Rhema, and Tamar are taking up lodging in Mary's place. The place is a little cramped, leading them to conclude that they need to start brainstorming ways to raise funds for the future, both for themselves and for Jesus' ministry. Mary sees Matthew standing outside, and when she approaches him, he voices that he doesn't know where to stay. He says that he's confused and will probably just go pitch a tent somewhere. When she suggests going to his family, he voices the memory from the past regarding his father. He thanks the women for caring for him and departs, leaving them to look on in sorrow. Mary comments that Matthew is a good man, and then they start debating about Joanna and what her intentions truly were. Speaking of Joanna, she and John have made it the 120-mile journey down to Machaerus. Joanna warns the guard that she can ruin his reputation if he doesn't keep silent, and she and John pass on into the cells where they find the baptizer. John tells Andrew to focus on Jesus, and both Andrew and Joanna recount the sermon to John, who gets more and more excited as they talk. He's thrilled at the mention of thousands being present to hear Jesus' message, and reminds Andrew that there's no need to worry about his imprisonment. As the prophets foretold, the Messiah would open the prison doors and free the captives. Andrew admits that Jesus' lesson on anxiety was the thing that convicted him the most, and John gives him simple advice. If you want to help me, listen to him. Do what he says. Back in Judas's hometown, he packs up his stuff and begins to head out, stopping to visit his sister Devorah before leaving. While initially excited to see him, Devorah quickly begins to vocalize some of her concerns. Judas explains that his life can't always be about money, but Devorah responds that with him, it's never not about money. He gives her the deed to his house and the mint plant that sat on the windowsill, entrusting both to her care. He tells her that he will help out with money and use his financial skills to advance Jesus' ministry, explaining that he is confident that Jesus is the Messiah. While he knows that following a Messiah figure is a dangerous task, he reminds her that if Jesus is the Messiah, he will not be killed. His job is to destroy, not to be destroyed. Devorah reminds Judas that he is the last of the Iscariot name, but Judas once again reassures her, Adonai has set me apart for a reason I do not yet know. At the synagogue once again, Yusuf delivers a confidential letter addressed to Nicodemus of the Sanhedrin. When Jairus notes that the letter isn't sealed, Yusuf smiles. As the episode reaches its close, we find two different people walking to two different doorways for two different moments of reconciliation. Once again, The Chosen always does such a good job at bookending episodes and giving us those nice poetic parallels. First up is Andrew, who has made the 120-mile return journey from Machaerus. He knocks on Mary Magdalene's door and, with Jesus' teachings fresh on his mind, apologizes for the awful way he treated her in the back half of season 2. She receives his apology and forgives her, commenting that no one has ever apologized to her before. He says that she deserves better. Andrew admits that he has a lot to learn, and he departs. Matthew, meanwhile, knocks on Alphaeus' door. Or should I say that he intends to knock on Alphaeus' door before he is rudely interrupted by the return of his loyal friend, the black dog, which we haven't seen since season 1. Eventually the door is opened. However, he needn't say any words at all, because his presence alone carries the message with it. No sooner does the name Alphaeus come out of Matthew's mouth than his father looks at him and says, "Son." With Matthew's face contorting in absolute confusion, the episode cuts to black. All in all, I've got to say that this episode was a strong start to season 3. I've mentioned this in the past, but I think that season openers are always going to be a bit wonky structure-wise for The Chosen, just because they have to resolve the last season's story arc while also setting in motion the story arc for the season to come, and that's always going to be a little bit more difficult when you're telling a story rooted in historical fact that resists the liberties afforded by complete artistic freedom and fictional embellishment, and that's even more so the case whenever you're telling a story rooted in the Bible, because you've got to be especially careful where you take fictional liberties and embellishments, and I think we see that in a lot of the pushback that The Chosen gets, but I've got to say, I think that they handle it really, really well, and they do a stand-up job in all the ways they adapt this stuff. Still, I think this episode comes out guns blazing and doesn't waste any time in setting the ball in motion for the story arcs to come. While personally, as a Bible teacher, I had hoped for the entire Sermon on the Mount to be included, artistically speaking, I 100% understand why they opted to make it an extended montage that omitted certain portions, which is kind of what I expected going in. It just makes more sense from a dramatic storytelling perspective. For the story, I think that this is actually more fitting, because the content of what was said isn't nearly as important as the effect that those words have on the characters within the story, and I think we're going to see those effects throughout the rest of the seasons to come, which is what's most important when you're telling a dramatic story like this. That all being said, what did you think about The Chosen Season 3, Episode 1? Let me know the positives, the negatives, and the in-betweens in the comment section down below, and to take things a step further, let me know what your favorite teaching is from the Sermon on the Mount and why you love it so much. It could be one of the things that we have mentioned in the episode, but it could be something beyond that. Just let me know in the comments down below. Like I said, I have a whole lot of Chosen-related content planned for y'all in the coming weeks and months, so be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you know when those things are coming at you. Until then, I'm David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy.